From KCBS Radio in San Francisco, I'm Matt Pitman, and this is Bay Current for Thursday, January 6th. 1 year ago today, the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol during the certification of the 2020 presidential election. Reflecting on 1 year since the insurrection can feel pretty overwhelming, I'll be honest. Looking at what happened and what we've learned versus where we are right now. How it changed everything about the national political landscape. Some of the most thoughtful voices about our current state of the union, in my opinion, have been from thebulwark.com. This is a collection of essentially never Trumpers. These are folks who were talk radio hosts, national writers of the highest reputation in conservative circles for decades, but they could never come around to getting on the Trump train around 2015 and 2016. So I connected with Tim Miller, writer with The Bulwark. Tim's career in Republican politics is extensive. He was communications director for the 2016 presidential campaign of Jeb Bush. Before that, comms director in 2012 for the presidential campaign of John Huntsman. Later, he joined Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign. Tim and his family make their home here in the Bay Area, in Oakland. And so I thought he'd be the perfect person to connect with, to look back at 1 year ago today, everything that's happened and what it means moving forward. Bulwark writer Tim Miller, former Republican strategist, right, Tim? Former? I got the former in there?
Former.
That is correct. Okay. You were pretty deep in the machine for a number of years. You were comms director for Jeb Bush's 2016 presidential campaign. I believe John Huntsman in 2012, and later in that campaign, the eventual nominee, Mitt Romney, you worked on that campaign as well. So to say former Republican, I mean, that was I imagine, a pretty seminal life event for you to kind of step away from that in the wake of what your personal convictions told you about how the Republican Party was trending as Donald Trump was ascending to the nomination back in 2016.
Yeah, I was always one of the more moderate Republicans, as you could tell by that resume item. I was McCain before that, so all of the now extinct rhinos. But I thought it was worth fighting for, and part of it is, I think, when you're in politics, your party identification is part of your identity, in a way that it might not be for, I think, regular folks who aren't as obsessive about politics as we are, whose profession is in politics. But I wanted to stick with it through 2020. I knew it would probably be fruitless, but I was hoping someone would try to primary Trump in order to, send a message that there was another type of Republican out there. There's another type of conservative. And, obviously it was clear that there's just no interest in that at this point. And so, it's interesting relevant to our 1-6 conversation. I wrote about leaving the party about a month after the November 2020 election, officially leaving the party. And I cited as the last straw the ongoing election fraud conspiracies. And I just said, this is too much. Like, this is not recoverable. We lost the election. It's the world's longest running democracy. We need to have a peaceful transfer of power. This is how we've always done it. And the fact that no one was standing up to Trump, everyone was going along with it up until January 6th, after he had already lost, was just the final straw. And I sensed, I didn't know exactly what was going to happen. I don't think any of us expected that, our Capitol was going to be stormed. But I sensed that something very bad was going to happen, watching, the fallout from the post-election, and just knew I could no longer be a part of it. And then, it all came to life on January the 6th.
So looking back at it, one full calendar year later, and I hope this doesn't sound too hyperbolic or melodramatic, but it almost feels like this was inevitable at this point, especially as we've learned so much about the layers of coordination and all the pieces of information that we continue to find out, that Donald Trump shattered norms daily for 4 years as president of the United States, and he couldn't have done that without a deep network of enablers to surround him and say, okay, we'll sign off on this, whether that was at various degrees, Paul Ryan, or later on a Kevin McCarthy, the more extreme wings inside on Capitol Hill, guys like Jim Jordan, things like that. But am I being too dramatic to say it kind of feels like, of course, this would be how the Trump presidency would end?
I like the word "of course" because of course it would, and those of us whose eyes were wide open in 2015. I was never Trumper way back in 2016. Voted for Hillary, and as part of a group that was very ironically now called Our Principles PAC, that was trying to stop Trump from winning the nomination. I joined that a couple days after Jeb lost, and literally every member of Our Principles PAC, including the funders, ended up supporting Donald Trump in the general election, except for me and one other person. So that was a good preview for me into how complicit everyone was going to be. So for those who are eyes wide open about all of Trump's manifest flaws, of course it was going to end. I don't like the word inevitable because history is contingent, right? And I think that a lot of times there is a sense from analysts and people to want to say that that there are these broad trends that are going on over the scope of history, and that there's nothing that can be done. And yes, there's a global populist trend, and yes, I think that Donald Trump's flaws, we all knew that it was going to end in disaster, but something could have been done. Choices could have been made differently, right? It wasn't inevitable in the sense that had a few more people done the right thing, right? I mean, on the one hand, it wasn't inevitable that it would fail, right? If you had Marjorie Taylor Greene instead of Brad Raffensperger as the Georgia Secretary of State, maybe the Georgia situation would have been different, right? If you had a Republican in office in Montana, or not Montana, excuse me, in Michigan and Pennsylvania instead of Democrats, maybe things would have been different there as far as trying to overturn the results. So it could have been worse, but it also could have been better. I had Mike Pence spoken out earlier, and all of and John Kelly and Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, had all these people said on November 8th, enough. Okay, it's over, right? Had these guys all stood shoulder to shoulder and said it's over, there still would have been a rump group that was pushing for this kind of preposterous coup and the election fraud conspiracies, but I don't think it would have had the momentum. It got the momentum it did because all of these guys refused to stand up to him, and that's our big lesson, because they still are refusing to stand up to him today, a year later.
So one of your colleagues at the Bulwark, JVL, Jonathan V. Last, he's said over and over again, I think also JVL might be my spirit animal, because he says things that I think and I'm not willing to say out loud, certainly not on a podcast. But one of the things he says is that the Republican Party doesn't have a Trump problem. They have a voter problem. They are so scared of their voters because Donald Trump has such a vice grip on the base, right? And that's reflected in some of the most recent polling that has come out over the last few days, that 60%, according to the latest AP Norse poll, 60% of Republicans say that Trump bears little or no responsibility. And even that number is like 11 points lower than it was a year ago. Yeah. And only 41% of respondents in this poll, Tim, said that Republicans in Congress deserve a great deal or quite a bit of responsibility. So if there's no penalty for these members of Congress who go along with this, and then you mentioned that, hey, yeah, if Marjorie Taylor Greene is the Secretary of State in Georgia and not Brad Raffensperger, we might be having a completely different conversation right now. So isn't that the concern, though, that now the blueprint has been manufactured and they have the playbook to do this again? If they lose the presidential election in 2024, that they now have a playbook where they can actually go and actually run a cleaner coup, if you will.
Yeah. Look, I think that is right. The sense that the trouble within the Republican Party, it's it's a bottom up problem, right? It's top down from in the sense that Trump has all of his personal flaws, right? But the fact that the voters want all of this is what's driving these decisions. And I think in a weird way, that's how, like us never Trumpers, former Republicans, we all have our flaws. We're not, all seeing and see things perfect. Obviously, I missed stuff leading up to 2016, or maybe I wouldn't have been going along with it as long as I did. But one thing we saw clearly is exactly what you say, that it's the voters that are in charge, and the voters want this chaos. The voters want the left, and we're on San Francisco podcast, so we'll say the coastal elites. Yep. They want them punished, right? Like that's what these voters are looking for. They wanted someone that was going to fight for it, no matter what the rules were. And so on January 6th and 7th, when you remember, kind of after it happened, the Lindsey Grahams of the world and Mitch McConnell speaking out against this for a day or two. we at the Bulwark, we all knew that wasn't going to last, because we were seeing this clearly, is that those guys are still, servants to the mob. Right? They're servants to their own voters, and their voters are going to want them to go along with this. But they were letting their emotions get the better of them that day. And so I think that explains what you've seen this last year, where all of those people who are outraged at Trump, there have been plenty of videos you can go on and look about what Republicans were saying the week after January 6th, 2021, and how their tune has changed. The reason that has happened is because of what the voters want. And so now if you look at who's running for office in Republicans at lower office, at Secretary of State, all the way up to Senate office, all of these people are still fully in on the coup, right? Like, not only has there not been a backtrack after what happened at the Capitol, it's actually gotten worse. The party is more lockstep in this notion that, the election was stolen and that next time that they have to do it better. That's the scary part about all this.
Right. You mentioned the word fight, and that's the word that we heard, when Donald Trump came down the escalator in 2015, the people latched onto him, was that he's a fighter. He fights for us. And then it just became all about the fight and obstruction in Congress and just doing stuff just because they could, because it made the libs mad. It was all about owning the libs. We talk about I'm talking about that like as a metaphor, right? But when you look at, again, some of this polling, what was it, the CBS YouGov poll, like 62% of Americans said that they expect violence over losing in future presidential elections. Even more concerning of that kind of subset of numbers, 40% of Republicans, Tim, said that violence against government is sometimes justified. And so at what point did we sort of cross that Rubicon, if you will, to fight being this metaphor for a guy who's going to go in there and ostensibly shake up the system like they hoped Donald Trump would, versus actually fighting with, hammers and baseball bats and the sort of violence that we saw on the 6th last year?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that obviously that Trump, was symptom and cause, right? So some of this dates back further, and you look back to the Tea Party, this was a big rallying cry for them, right? It was like fighting against the Obama administration, fighting against Obamacare. They'd shut down the government a couple of times. So they didn't really have any plan with what they were going to do. But John Boehner and those moderates, they just want to work with Obama and compromise. We need somebody that's going to fight him, right? So it went back before Trump. But I think that the violence, Trump was the first time, at least in our era, right? And I think if you go back to the 60s and 70s, obviously there are other examples of this, George Wallace, et cetera. And, obviously we don't want to undermine that in like the racial violence of the civil rights era. But in the modern times, in this century, Trump was the first time when he was running in 2016, when he was encouraging literal fighting, right?
Yes.
I remember there'd be people at his rallies and he'd say, beat them up, and say, he said that he'd pay for people's bills, if they got, if they got in trouble for fighting the protesters at their rallies. Now, he never was going to, because he's a scam artist, but right, like that was what he said, right? He told them that, that he would give them cover for this. And there was this kind of machismo of the MAGA, of, right, this tough guy. Right? So it transcended fighting on policy into a much more, I think, sort of physical, like overcompensating masculinity, right? And I think that Trump himself was a big instigator of that, of that progression, of something that was, he grabbed onto this anger and this desire to fight that had been bubbling on the right for a long time, and I think he manifested it and made it more, into what we saw in the 6th.
Mm-hmm. Even today, we learned that Biden administration, they've talked about some of the findings that various Justice Department investigations have uncovered about lapses in security, lack of preparation, lack of information sharing and intelligence, and various aspects of what I think is kind of a conventional approach to safety and security and just like policing, if you will.
Yeah.
But is that the wrong approach to avoiding this happening again? Instead of worrying, we need more barricades, we need to more officers, National Guard needs to stand by. That's all fine and well, but when you've got the dudes with the congressional pin on their lapels and their suit and ties, and they're in there during the certification, and they're throwing or attempting to throw out entire states' ballots, when you've got members of Congress that are willing to sign off on this and manipulate the Constitution any which way they can to get the guy in that they want, I don't think that the National Guard's going to really come in handy for that, right? So
this is where Garland. Yeah, this is where Garland and the January 6th committee really need to step up, because we already talked about how voters aren't going to hold these people responsible, the perpetrators, the people who planned all this, the people who voted to take away people's legal vote. And you're right. I think this typical policing. I'm happy with the fact that the FBI has done a good job going after the people that went into the Capitol, particularly those that are violent. But, some of these people are mentally deranged, right? Like some of these people are in some ways victims themselves, right? Like they were lied to, and they were their grievances were animated by people who were just thirsty for power, right? And so, those folks should face the consequences of the law. But it doesn't do anything to solve our greater problems, and it doesn't satisfy me really for the QAnon shaman guy in the horns to go to jail. Yeah. It's like the guy in the horns isn't the problem. I mean, he's part of the problem, but he's a small part of the problem. The problem was the people, as you said, with congressional pins who were working to plan this. It was Peter Navarro inside the White House. It was Steve Bannon, Trump's former chief strategist, who was, I'm working on an article on him, who's running a pro-insurrection podcast that's in the top 10 on Apple still today, right? Like these are the orchestrators that need to be held to account, and as of yet, we're not seeing that.
So, grab your crystal ball and let's look ahead a little bit. It's 2024, whether it's President Biden or it's Vice President Harris. The Democrat nominee wins the election, wins the popular vote, wins the Electoral College vote. Are we talking about President Donald Trump? Is Donald Trump going to be president in 2024 because it's going to be a much cleaner version of getting him appointed president than it was in the attempted coup in 2021?
Man, it's a long way out from that. So I'm bad at predictions. I don't want to get my crystal ball. I think the most important thing is that's not crazy.
It's like, isn't that nuts? It's crazy that it's not crazy.
Chance. Yeah. Right, yeah. Even if there's only a 2%, I think it might be a little higher, that there could be a situation where, look, if this election was closer, Biden won it by enough that they would have had to overturn 3 states. You need a lot of people complicit, right? You need state legislatures and secretaries of state, 3 different states to overturn it. Then you need all the Republican Congress to go along with it, right? So it was never really going to happen for them in 2020, even if things had gone better. But what if it had only been 1 state, right? And what if that state had been closer, been more like Florida in 2000, right? Where it was close to a coin flip, right? Is it possible that next time that they would try to flip it and not send the electors, and that Republicans would hold the House of Representatives, and that the election would be thrown to the House of Representatives like it was back in 1876? That's very possible, and I think that the Democrats and the public need to take very seriously, the ramifications of something such as that. And I think the downstream effects would obviously, between the violence and the instability, I mean, it's really hard to imagine all the potential risks from that. And so even if that's only a 2% chance, I think it's a little bit higher than that, but even if it's only a 2% chance, we need to be very serious about doing everything possible to stamp out that 2% chance, reform the Electoral Count Act, to make the changes that are necessary to guard against that. And I'm a little bit concerned about the lack of urgency on that front coming out of Washington.
Thanks again to Tim Miller, writer at the Bulwark. And thank you for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Bay Current on the Odyssey app, Apple or Google Podcasts, or just about anywhere you listen. We have new episodes out every day, and we'd love to be part of your routine. We're also on YouTube on the KCBS Radio YouTube page. That's it for today's Bay Current. I'm Matt Pitman. We'll chat with you again tomorrow.